Hello, and welcome to another gentle descent into the past. Tonight, we'll open the doors to a world once lost, now rediscovered through quiet storytelling. Perhaps you're lying still beneath the covers, letting the last hours of the day melt away. Either way, I'm honoured to have you here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. Are we continents apart, or just a few time zones away, both listening as the stars come out? If you enjoy resting to soft-spoken tales and thoughtful history, be sure to subscribe. There's so much more to uncover together. The medieval mind approached law differently than we do today. Where we seek consistency and precedent, they often relied on tradition, divine judgment, and what we might charitably call creative problem-solving. Laws were not merely rules to be followed, but reflections of deeply held beliefs about morality, social order, and the very nature of truth itself. Consider the peculiar case of animal trials, a legal tradition that flourished across medieval Europe for several centuries. Yes, you heard correctly. Animals could be put on trial, complete with legal representation, formal proceedings, and even appeals. In 1386, a pig in Fête, France was tried and executed for killing an infant. The pig was dressed in human clothing for the execution, as if to emphasize its moral culpability. This was not an isolated incident, but part of a broader legal framework that held animals accountable for their actions, in ways that seem almost fantastical to us now. These animal trials were not mere curiosities, but reflected deep-seated beliefs about justice and moral order. Medieval people believed that all of creation was bound by divine law, and when that law was broken, even by a beast, justice demanded satisfaction. Pigs that killed children, bulls that gored farmers, and even insects that destroyed crops could find themselves defendants in formal legal proceedings. The legal representation provided to these animal defendants was often surprisingly thorough. In 1750, a female donkey was tried for bestiality alongside her human accomplice in France. The donkey's defense attorney argued successfully that she had been an unwilling participant, and she was acquitted, while the man was executed. Witnesses even testified to the donkey's good character and previous virtuous behavior. But animals were not the only unexpected defendants in medieval courts. Inanimate objects too could find themselves on trial. If a sword killed someone, the weapon itself might be tried and banished from the realm. Bells that had rung during violent storms were sometimes put on trial for their role in summoning destructive weather. Trees that had fallen and killed passers-by could be formally prosecuted and sentenced to be cut down and removed. These object trials reflected a worldview where the boundaries between the animate and inanimate, the moral and immoral, were far more fluid than our modern understanding would suggest. Every element of creation was seen as part of a grand moral order, and when that order was disrupted, the law stepped in to restore balance. The concept of trial by ordeal added another layer of strangeness to medieval justice. These were legal procedures designed to determine guilt or innocence through divine intervention. The underlying belief was that God would not allow an innocent person to suffer harm during these tests, making them a form of supernatural lie detector. Trial by hot iron was one such ordeal. The accused would be required to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a specified distance, usually 9 paces. Their hand would then be bandaged and examined after 3 days. If the wound was healing cleanly, they were declared innocent. If it showed signs of infection or poor healing, guilt was assumed. Trial by cold water involved throwing the accused into a body of water while bound. If they floated, they were considered guilty, as the pure water was rejecting them. If they sank and drowned, they were posthumously declared innocent. This presented what we might call a significant design flaw in the justice system, as innocence could only be proven through death. Perhaps most dramatically, trial by combat allowed disputes to be settled through physical battle. This could involve the actual disputants fighting each other, or they could hire champions to fight on their behalf. The belief was that God would ensure victory for the righteous party. Interestingly, this practice was not limited to men. Women, clergy, and the elderly could all demand trial by combat, though they typically employed champions rather than fighting personally. The legal status of various professions in medieval Europe also produced some wonderfully strange laws. Executioners, for instance, occupied a peculiar position in society. While their services were essential for the functioning of the justice system, they were often considered ritually unclean and were subjected to numerous restrictions. In many German states, executioners were required to live outside town walls and could only enter the town to perform their duties. They were forbidden from touching food in markets, as their touch was believed to contaminate goods. Interestingly, executioners often supplemented their income by working as healers and veterinarians. Their intimate knowledge of anatomy, gained through their primary profession, made them surprisingly effective medical practitioners. This created the paradoxical situation where the same person might take a life in the morning and save one in the afternoon. The legal treatment of debt in medieval Europe produced some particularly inventive solutions. In parts of medieval France, a debtor who could not pay might be required to sit naked in the town square while crying out their shame to all who passed. This public humiliation was designed both as punishment and as a way to encourage charitable contributions from passers-by. Some regions developed the concept of debt inheritance in ways that seem almost surreal today. In certain parts of medieval Germany, unpaid debts could be inherited by the debtor's children, but only if they had been present when the debt was incurred. This led to the strange practice of excluding children from important financial discussions to protect them from future liability. The regulation of markets and trade produced its own category of unusual laws. In medieval London, the punishment for selling bad food was often poetic justice taken to extremes. Bakers who sold underweight bread might be dragged through the streets on a hurdle with the offending loaf hung around their necks. Brewers who watered down their ale could be forced to drink only their own inferior product for a specified period. The medieval understanding of property rights also led to some fascinating legal concepts. The doctrine of treasure trove held that any valuable object found buried in the ground belonged to the crown, based on the assumption that it had been hidden with the intention of retrieval. However, if the treasure was found above ground, it belonged to the finder, leading to complex legal debates about exactly what constituted buried versus merely hidden. These strange laws were not merely the products of backward thinking or primitive legal understanding. They reflected sophisticated attempts to maintain social order in a world very different from our own. Medieval society faced challenges we can barely imagine: constant warfare, devastating plagues, economic uncertainty, and the ever-present threat of famine. In such a world, laws needed to be more than mere rules. They needed to be mechanisms for preserving the delicate balance that kept communities together. The apparent strangeness of these laws often dissolves when we understand the context in which they operated. What seems bizarre to us made perfect sense to people living in a world where divine judgment was a daily reality, where community harmony was essential for survival, and where justice needed to be both seen and felt by all members of society. As we drift deeper into the medieval world, we begin to see that these strange laws were threads in a complex tapestry of belief, tradition, and practical necessity. They tell us not just about legal systems, but about entire ways of understanding the world, human nature, and our place in the grand scheme of creation. In our next exploration, we will delve deeper into the curious world of medieval marriage laws, where love, politics, and legal ingenuity combined to create some of the most fascinating and bewildering regulations in European history. But for now, let the strange and wonderful world of medieval justice settle gently in your mind as you drift toward peaceful sleep. The medieval world was one of stark contrasts when it came to food. While kings and nobles feasted on elaborate banquets with exotic spices and multiple courses, the vast majority of people lived on the edge of starvation, their meals consisting of little more than coarse bread and thin gruel. This disparity wasn't merely about wealth, it was a reflection of an entire social system built on inequality. For the common peasant, meat was an extraordinary luxury. A family might keep a pig or a few chickens, but these animals were far too valuable to slaughter regularly. Instead, they provided eggs, milk, and the occasional offspring that could be sold for much-needed coin. When meat did appear on the peasant table, it was usually during religious festivals or when an animal was too old or sick to serve any other purpose. Even then, every scrap was used. from organ meats to blood puddings, as nothing could be wasted in a world where the next meal was never guaranteed. The preservation of food presented another monumental challenge. Without refrigeration, medieval people had to rely on salting, smoking, drying, and fermentation to keep their food from spoiling. Salt itself was expensive and often of poor quality, filled with impurities that could make preserved meats taste terrible or even cause illness. Fish were packed in barrels with heavy salt, creating a product that bore little resemblance to fresh seafood. Vegetables were pickled in vinegar or fermented into sauerkraut, while fruits were dried into leathery strips that could last through the winter months. But perhaps the most insidious problem was the widespread adulteration of food. Unscrupulous merchants and bakers, driven by poverty and desperation, regularly cut corners to maximize their profits. Bread, the staple of the medieval diet, was often stretched with sawdust, chalk, ground acorns, or even bone meal. These additives not only made the bread less nutritious, but could also be dangerous to consume. Similarly, ale and wine were frequently watered down, leaving consumers with weak, unpalatable drinks that provided little refreshment or nutrition. The story of Agnes, a fictional but representative alewife, illustrates these challenges perfectly. Struggling to support her family after her husband's death, Agnes found herself faced with rising grain prices and dwindling customers. Desperate to make her ale last longer and increase her profits, she began watering down her brew. At first, the deception went unnoticed, but word soon spread about the weak, tasteless ale. Her once loyal customers began seeking other establishments, and Agnes's reputation was ruined. Eventually, she was forced to close her business, leaving her family in even more desperate circumstances. The authorities did attempt to regulate food quality through laws like the Assize of Bread and Ale, which set standards for weight, price, and quality. Violators could face fines, public humiliation in the pillory, or even corporal punishment. In some cases, dishonest bakers were dragged through the streets with their substandard loaves hung around their necks as a warning to others. However, enforcement was inconsistent and often ineffective, as the underlying economic pressures that drove people to adulterate their products remained unchanged. The lack of variety in the medieval diet was another source of suffering. While we today can enjoy fruits and vegetables from around the world year-round, medieval people were entirely dependent on what could be grown locally and what was in season. For most of the year, peasants subsisted on a monotonous diet of porridge made from barley, oats or rye, accompanied by whatever vegetables they could grow in their small garden plots. Onions, leeks and cabbages were among the hardiest crops, but these provided little in the way of essential vitamins and minerals. The seasonal nature of food availability meant that late winter and early spring were particularly difficult times. By then, the previous year's harvest would be running low, and the new crops had not yet matured. This period, known as the Hunger Gap, was when malnutrition was most severe and death rates highest. Children born during these lean months often suffered from stunted growth and weakened immune systems that would affect them for the rest of their lives. Spices, which we now take for granted, were among the most precious commodities in medieval Europe. Pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg had to be transported over vast distances along dangerous trade routes, making them extraordinarily expensive. A pound of nutmeg in the 11th century could cost as much as 7 oxen, putting it far beyond the reach of ordinary people. For the wealthy, spices were not just flavouring agents, but symbols of status and power, displayed as prominently as jewels or fine clothing. The contrast between rich and poor was perhaps nowhere more evident than in the royal feast. These elaborate affairs were designed not just to feed the nobility, but to demonstrate their wealth and power. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted peacocks, swans, and other exotic birds, their feathers carefully replaced after cooking to create stunning visual displays. Sugar sculptures called subtleties depicted scenes from mythology or heraldic symbols, while servants paraded dishes through the hall with great ceremony. Yet even these magnificent feasts came with their own dangers. Without understanding of food safety, even the wealthy were vulnerable to food poisoning and other ailments. The death of King John of England in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, serves as a reminder that in the medieval world every meal was potentially hazardous. The king had been travelling through the countryside when he stopped at an abbey and indulged in what he thought was a harmless treat. Within days, he was dead from what modern historians believe was severe food poisoning. The unsanitary conditions of medieval life compounded these food safety issues. Peasant families often shared their single-room dwellings with their livestock, as the animals provided warmth during the cold winter months. However, this arrangement meant that animal waste, insects, and vermin were constant presences in the home. Food was prepared and consumed in these same spaces, with contamination almost inevitable. In medieval cities, the situation was even worse. Narrow, winding streets were filled with garbage, human waste, and the refuse from various trades and industries. The lack of proper sewage systems meant that waste often contaminated water sources, making even drinking water dangerous. The Thames in London, for example, serves simultaneously as the city's primary water source and its main sewer, a situation that contributed to frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. The Catholic Church added another layer of complexity to medieval food culture through its extensive fasting requirements. During Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, the faithful were expected to abstain from meat, dairy products, and eggs. For the wealthy, this meant substituting fish and other alternatives, but for the poor, it often meant simply going without. Wednesdays, Fridays, and Saturdays were also designated as meatless days throughout the year, further restricting an already limited diet. While the Church's intentions may have been spiritual, the practical effect of these restrictions was often to worsen the nutritional status of people who were already malnourished. The story of John and Matilda, a fictional peasant couple, illustrates this dilemma. With 3 children to feed and only a small plot of land, they struggled to provide adequate nutrition even in the best of times. During Lent, they were expected to give up the small amounts of preserved meat and dairy that provided crucial protein and calories. As the days wore on, their children grew weak and listless, crying constantly from hunger. John, a devout man, wrestled with his faith as he watched his family suffer, while Matilda secretly dreamed of the hearty stew she would make when the fast finally ended. Not all of the Church's influence on food was negative, however. Monasteries and abbeys, with their extensive land holdings and well-organized communities, often served as centers of agricultural innovation. Monks pioneered new techniques in crop rotation, irrigation, and animal husbandry that gradually improved food production. They also served as sources of charity, distributing bread and ale to the hungry, and providing shelter for travelers and pilgrims. The story of St. Hildegard of Bingen exemplifies the positive aspects of the Church's relationship with food. Born into a noble family in 12th century Germany, Hildegard became an abbess and was renowned for her knowledge of herbal medicine and nutrition. She wrote extensively about the properties of different grains and foods, advocating for spelt as a healthier alternative to common wheat. Under her guidance, the nuns at her abbey produced high-quality bread that was distributed to the sick and poor in the surrounding community. Hildegard's holistic approach to nutrition, which emphasized the connection between food and health, was remarkably prescient and would not be fully appreciated until modern times. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 represents perhaps the darkest chapter in medieval food history. A catastrophic combination of climate change, crop failures, and political instability plunged much of Europe into 7 years of starvation and misery. Contemporary chronicles paint a horrifying picture of the suffering endured by ordinary people. The Flemish chronicler William of Nangis wrote that men ate dogs, horses, cats, and other unclean things, while other accounts describe people resorting to cannibalism in their desperation. The famine hit different regions with varying severity, but nowhere was spared entirely. In some areas of the Low Countries and Scandinavia, mortality rates reached 10 to 25% of the population. The German city of Erfurt saw an average of 16 deaths per day during the worst years, compared to just 2 per day in normal times. The psychological impact of the famine was as devastating as the physical toll, creating a generation scarred by the memory of extreme hunger and loss. Even in normal times, the threat of food scarcity was never far away. A single failed harvest could spell disaster for entire communities, and peasant families lived in constant fear of the next crisis. This precarious existence shaped every aspect of medieval life, from marriage and family planning to religious beliefs and social structures. People developed elaborate strategies for coping with scarcity, from complex systems of mutual aid to detailed knowledge of wild plants and alternative food sources. The contrast between medieval food culture and our modern abundance is striking. Today we can walk into a supermarket and find fruits from South America, spices from Asia, and vegetables from around the world, all neatly packaged and ready to eat. We have access to a variety of foods that would have been unimaginable to even the wealthiest medieval nobles. Our understanding of nutrition, food safety and preservation has transformed eating from a daily struggle into a source of pleasure and nourishment. Yet this abundance comes with its own challenges. We grapple with issues of food waste, environmental sustainability, and diet-related health problems that were unknown in the medieval world. The global food system that provides us with such variety also creates new forms of inequality and environmental degradation. Perhaps there are lessons to be learned from our medieval ancestors about the value of local seasonal eating and the importance of not taking food for granted. The story of medieval food is ultimately a story of human resilience and ingenuity in the face of enormous challenges. Despite the constant threats of hunger, disease, and adulteration, people found ways to survive and even create moments of joy and celebration around food. They developed preservation techniques that are still used today, created dishes that evolved into modern cuisines, and established traditions of hospitality and sharing that continue to shape our culture. As we reflect on this distant past, we gain a deeper appreciation for the progress we have made and the privileges we enjoy. The simple act of opening a refrigerator or visiting a grocery store represents centuries of advancement in agriculture, technology, and social organization. At the same time, the medieval experience reminds us of our fundamental dependence on food and the importance of ensuring that everyone has access to adequate nutrition. The legacy of medieval food culture lives on in many ways. Traditional preservation methods like smoking and fermentation have experienced a renaissance among modern cooks seeking authentic flavors and sustainable practices. The seasonal rhythms that once dictated medieval diets are being rediscovered by those promoting local and sustainable agriculture. Even the elaborate feasts of the nobility have their modern counterparts in the fine dining establishments that turn meals into theatrical experiences. Perhaps, most importantly, the medieval experience teaches us about the deep connections between food, community, and survival. In a world where hunger was a constant threat, sharing food became one of the most fundamental expressions of human compassion and solidarity. The communal meals that marked religious festivals and life transitions were not just celebrations, but affirmations of social bonds and mutual support. As we drift off to sleep in our modern world of abundance, we can remember the countless generations who struggled to fill their bellies with whatever meagre sustenance they could find. Their perseverance in the face of such hardship reminds us of the resilience of the human spirit and the importance of gratitude for the simple blessings we often take for granted. In honoring their memory, we commit ourselves to building a world where no one needs suffer the pangs of hunger that defines so much of human history. As the candle-lit shadows danced across the stone walls of medieval castles, a stark culinary divide defined the era. While nobles feasted on exotic delicacies and sumptuous banquets, the vast majority of medieval Europeans faced a daily struggle for sustenance that would horrify modern sensibilities. The scarcity of spices created one of the most glaring differences between rich and poor. While a pound of nutmeg in the 11th century cost as much as 7 fattened oxen, peasants made do with whatever meagre seasonings they could find. Garlic, mustard, and vinegar became their primary weapons against the relentless blandness of their daily fare. The absence of reliable preservation methods meant fresh produce remained seasonal luxuries, leaving most to subsist on monotonous grains and whatever hardy vegetables could survive the harsh climate. Meat consumption revealed perhaps the starkest inequality. A prosperous peasant family might slaughter their pig only once a year, usually at Christmas, while nobles gorged themselves on elaborate dishes featuring exotic game. When meat did grace the peasant table, it often came in forms that would turn modern stomachs. organ meats, blood puddings, and cuts from animals too old or sick for other purposes. Fish offered some relief for those near water sources, but even this was typically preserved through heavy salting, creating a far cry from the delicate preparations we know today. The Church's influence permeated every aspect of medieval food culture, often compounding the hardships faced by the poor. Lent's 40-day fast meant giving up what little meat and dairy peasants possessed, while wealthy nobles could afford exotic substitutes. The story of Agnes Paston, brought before a manorial court in 1322 for stealing bread during Lent to feed her starving children, illustrates the cruel irony of religious dietary restrictions imposed on those already living at the edge of starvation. Food adulteration ran rampant in an era without regulations or quality control. Unscrupulous bakers stretched their precious flour with sawdust, chalk, or ground acorns, creating dense, gritty loaves that provided little nutrition. Alewives watered down their brews to increase profits, leaving customers with weak, unsatisfying drinks that barely qualified as beverages. The Assize of Bread and Ale attempted to regulate these practices, but enforcement remained sporadic at best. Unsanitary conditions made every meal a potential hazard. Peasant families shared their cramped quarters with livestock, creating breeding grounds for disease and contamination. Animal waste mingled with food preparation areas, while flies and vermin spread filth throughout living spaces. Even kings weren't immune. King John of England's death in 1216, attributed to consuming spoiled peaches, demonstrated that contaminated food could fell rulers as easily as peasants. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322 revealed the precarious nature of medieval food security. 7 years of crop failures plunged Europe into starvation so severe that chroniclers reported cannibalism and people eating grass, bark, and even their own children. Mortality rates reached 25% in some regions, with cities like Erfurt averaging 16 deaths per day compared to 2 in normal times. Despite these overwhelming challenges, medieval people demonstrated remarkable resilience and ingenuity. They developed sophisticated preservation techniques through salting, smoking, and fermentation. Women who bore primary responsibility for feeding their families created folk traditions of pickling and foraging that sustained communities through lean times. Monasteries served as centres of agricultural innovation and charitable food distribution, offering some relief to the desperate. The rare medieval feast provided a stunning contrast to daily reality. Royal banquets featured dozens of elaborate dishes, roasted peacocks, sugar sculptures, and delicacies flavoured with precious spices. These displays of culinary opulence served not just as entertainment, but as powerful demonstrations of wealth and status, reminding all present of the vast gulf between the privileged few and the struggling masses. Perhaps most remarkably, medieval people found ways to create meaning and community around food despite its scarcity. Harvest festivals brought villagers together in celebration of successful crops. Wedding feasts, however modest, marked life's milestones with shared meals. Even the humblest pottage became an opportunity for families to gather around the hearth, telling stories and maintaining bonds that sustained them through hardship. The legacy of medieval food culture reminds us of both human vulnerability and resilience. In an age where we can access flavours from around the globe with unprecedented ease and safety, it's worth remembering those who found joy and sustenance in the simplest of meals. Their struggles and ingenuity laid the foundations for the abundance we now enjoy, teaching us never to take for granted the basic human right to nourishment and the profound satisfaction of sharing food with those we love. As we drift off to sleep with full bellies and endless choices at our fingertips, we can honour their memory by appreciating the remarkable journey that brought us from medieval scarcity to modern plenty. In every bite we take, we taste the hard-won progress of countless generations who transform necessity into the art of cuisine, ensuring that future generations might know abundance where they knew only want. Looking at your reference videos and existing script, I'll continue from where Part 3 left off, maintaining the sleep-inducing tone while exploring the harsh realities of medieval European law and society. As we've seen, the world of medieval Europe was one where even the most basic human needs were fraught with difficulty and danger. Food was scarce, often contaminated, and subject to the whims of weather and war. But perhaps even more challenging than securing one's next meal was navigating the complex and often brutal system of justice that governed daily life. The laws of medieval Europe were a patchwork of traditions, customs, and edicts that varied dramatically from one region to another, creating a landscape where justice was anything but certain. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval courthouse, imagine the tension as an accused thief stands before a panel of judges. The evidence against him is circumstantial at best, yet the consequences of a guilty verdict could mean the loss of a hand, an eye, or even his life. This was not a world of careful deliberation and reasoned argument, but one where justice was swift, harsh, and often arbitrary. The legal systems that governed medieval Europe were designed not so much to determine guilt or innocence, but to maintain order through fear, and to reinforce the rigid social hierarchies that kept peasants in their place and nobles in power. The foundation of medieval law rested upon a complex web of feudal obligations and customary practices that had evolved over centuries. At the heart of this system was the concept of personal loyalty and mutual obligation between lord and vassal. A peasant owed service to his lord not merely as a tenant, but as a bound serf, whose very existence was tied to the land he worked. In return, the lord was expected to provide protection and justice, though these protections were often more theoretical than real. The lord's court was typically held in the great hall of his manor, where he would sit in judgment over disputes between his tenants, crimes committed within his domain, and violations of the countless regulations that governed peasant life. These manorial courts dealt with a bewildering array of offences, from the trivial to the serious. A peasant might find himself hauled before his lord for allowing his pigs to wander into a neighbour's garden, for failing to attend the required number of days of labour service, or for the serious crime of attempting to leave the manor without permission. The punishments were often brutal and disproportionate to the crimes. A serf caught trying to flee might be branded on the forehead with a hot iron, marking him forever as a runaway. A woman accused of adultery might be forced to walk naked through the village while being pelted with stones and filth by her neighbours. The concept of individual rights as we understand them today was virtually non-existent in medieval legal thinking. Justice was not about protecting the innocent or ensuring fair treatment, but about maintaining social order and reinforcing the authority of those in power. The idea that all people might be equal before the law would have been laughable to a medieval lord, who saw himself as inherently superior to the peasants who worked his land. The law existed to serve the interests of the ruling class, and any benefits that might trickle down to the common people were incidental at best. Perhaps nowhere was this inequality more apparent than in the realm of criminal justice. When a crime was committed, the response of the authorities depended heavily on the social status of both the perpetrator and the victim. If a peasant stole a loaf of bread from a nobleman's table, he might face hanging or mutilation, but if a nobleman killed a peasant in a fit of rage, he might escape with nothing more than a fine or a token punishment, a stark reminder of the harsh realities of medieval power. As we conclude this journey into the peculiar world of medieval law and daily life, consider how different our modern understanding of justice truly is. We strive for equality before the law, for due process, and for punishments that fit the crime. The medieval period, with its animal trials, ordeals, and stark social divisions, offers a stark contrast, a world where the lines between animate and inanimate, crime and misfortune, were blurred by a blend of deeply held beliefs and the raw realities of power.